They almost won. The side that lost came within hours of a different outcome. Here is how close it really was. For decades, the world has looked at the United States Navy as an unstoppable force. A single American destroyer is like a floating fortress. It carries the Aegis combat system. This is a computer mind that can track hundreds of targets at the same time. It can fire missiles to hit planes that are still over the horizon. It can shoot down ballistic missiles falling from space. On paper, it is the most powerful shield ever built. But in the Strait of Hormuz, that shield has a breaking point. The strait is a narrow strip of water. At its thinnest point, it is only 21 miles wide. Through this tiny gap flows 20% of the world's oil. If the gap closes, the global economy stops. The United States keeps its ships there to make sure that never happens. Iran knows it cannot build a ship that can fight a United States destroyer one-on-one. An American ship costs $2 billion. It is packed with the best technology in human history. So Iran decided to play a different game. They did not build one big ship. Instead, they built thousands of tiny ones. These are fast boats. Some are no bigger than a civilian speedboat you would see at a lake. They are made of fiberglass. They are fast. They are hard to see on radar. And most importantly, they are cheap. You can build 1,000 of these boats for the price of one American ship. Iran's doctrine is simple. It is called the swarm. They do not expect one boat to win. They expect 99 boats to die so that the 100th boat can get close enough to strike. This is the physics of a saturation attack. Every defensive system has a limit. It is called magazine depth. An American destroyer carries about 90 missiles in its vertical launching cells. Once those 90 missiles are gone, the ship is just a very expensive target. If Iran sends 200 boats, the math starts to look very scary for the Americans. The Aegis system is fast, but it is not infinite. It has to choose which target to kill first. It has to track every single boat. It has to fire, confirm the hit, and move to the next. In the narrow waters of the strait, there is no room to run. There is no time to wait for help. The shore is only a few miles away. The boats can hide in the coves and behind the islands. They can pop out, fire their rockets, and disappear. Or they can just keep coming. This scenario begins on a Tuesday morning in 2026. A United States carrier strike group is moving through the strait. The tension has been building for weeks. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard has been shadowing the fleet. Usually, they just buzz the ships and leave. They take pictures, they shout over the radio. It is a tense game that both sides have played for years. But today, the game changed. Instead of 5 boats, there were 50. Then there were 100. The American commanders looked at their screens and saw a wall of green dots. The swarm was not just a threat anymore, it was happening. The Aegis system began to lock on. The sailors stood at their stations with their hands on the triggers. Everyone was waiting for one side to blink. But the boats did not turn away. They increased their speed. They began to spread out to surround the fleet from every direction. The computers began to scream. The limit was being reached. The most powerful navy in the world was about to find out if a billion-dollar shield could hold back 1,000 paper cuts. Imagine a captain standing on the bridge of a billion-dollar ship. He is looking at a screen that tells him everything. He can see every bird in the sky. He can see every metal object in the water for 50 miles. But right now, he is looking at something he was never trained for. He is looking at a wall of boats. They are not waiting for him to move. They are closing the distance, fast. The American ship is called a destroyer. It is designed to fight other big ships. It is designed to shoot down high-speed missiles. It is like a professional boxer who is ready for a heavyweight fight. But he is not being punched by a heavyweight. He is being swarmed by thousands of bees. The captain has a set of rules he has to follow. They are called rules of engagement. He cannot just start shooting because he is nervous. He has to wait until he is sure the other side is attacking. In the middle of the ocean, that is easy to see. In the narrow Strait of Hormuz, it is almost impossible. The Iranian boats are weaving in and out of civilian traffic. They are hiding behind oil tankers that are as long as skyscrapers. The American radar is the best in the world. but it has a hard time telling the difference between a fishing boat and a boat carrying a torpedo. Then, it happens. One of the small boats crosses an invisible line. It is less than 2 miles away. At that speed, it will hit the American ship in less than 60 seconds. The captain gives the order. The first shot is not a missile. It is a burst from a machine gun. The sound is like a giant zipper being pulled apart. The small boat disappears in a cloud of spray and wood. But the other 99 boats do not stop. They do not even slow down. They all fire at once. This is the moment the Aegis system was built for. The computers take over. The vertical launching cells on the deck of the ship fly open. Missiles scream into the air. They are incredibly accurate. Each one costs more than the boat it is trying to hit. The first 10 boats are gone in seconds. Then the next 10. The sea is filled with smoke and burning fuel, but more boats keep coming out of the haze. The Aegis system is fast, but it has a physical limit. The radar can only track so many things at once. The launchers can only fire so many missiles every minute. And most importantly, the ship is running out of bullets. Every time a missile hits a boat, the ship's magazine gets emptier. The crew in the belly of the ship can hear the missiles leaving. They know exactly how many are left. They start to realize the math is not in their favor. The Iranian commander knows this too. He is not trying to win a fair fight. He is trying to make the Americans use their best weapons on his cheapest boats. He is waiting for the magazine to reach zero. Suddenly, the radar screen changes. A new group of dots appears. These are not boats. These are missiles fired from the shore. They are flying low, just a few feet above the water. The Aegis system has to make a choice. Does it kill the boats that are almost touching the hull? Or does it kill the missiles that are coming from the mountains? The computer chooses the missiles. It has to. But that means the defense against the boats has stopped. For 30 seconds, the most powerful ship in the world is open. A group of 5 fast boats seize the gap. They floor their engines. They are bouncing over the waves at 50 miles an hour. The American sailors on the deck are firing their rifles. They are screaming over the noise of the engines. But the boats are too small. They are too fast. One boat is hit and flips over. The other 4 keep coming. One boat gets through the wall of lead. It slams into the side of the American destroyer. It is not a big explosion. Compared to a torpedo, it is tiny, but it is enough. The explosion happens right at the waterline. Water begins to pour into the engine room. The ship begins to tilt. The billion-dollar shield has been cracked. The heavyweight boxer has been stung. And the rest of the swarm is still coming. The status quo that has held for 50 years has just ended. The world is about to find out what happens when a superpower bleeds. The first hour after the strike was the loudest silence in the history of the modern Navy. For 50 years, the world believed that an American ship could not be touched. Then, in a single second, a fiberglass boat with a lawnmower engine proved everyone wrong. The explosion on the side of the destroyer was not like a movie. There was no giant fireball that swallowed the ship. It was a sharp, metal sound that traveled through the entire hull. Every sailor on that ship felt it in their teeth. They knew instantly that the rules of the world had changed. Inside the ship, the lights flickered and then went dark. The air was suddenly filled with the smell of salt water and burnt wires. The Aegis system, the brain of the ship, started to reset. For a few minutes, the most advanced weapon on Earth was blind. It was just a giant piece of steel sitting in a narrow channel. The captain did not have time to think about history. He had to save his ship. He gave the order to close the heavy doors to stop the water from spreading. This meant trapping some of his own men in the flooded areas. It was a choice between losing 10 people or losing 300. Outside, the rest of the American fleet saw the smoke. The commander on the aircraft carrier watched the scene through his binoculars. He had 10 more destroyers and cruisers around him. He had billions of dollars in technology at his fingertips, but he was suddenly terrified. If one boat could get through, how many others were coming? He had to make a decision that would change the world. He could stay and fight the swarm, or he could turn the entire fleet around and run. If he stayed, he risked losing more ships. If he ran, the United States would lose its reputation as the master of the seas. He gave the order to fight. He launched every jet on the deck of the carrier. The sound of the engines was like thunder rolling over the water. The pilots were told to hit anything that moved on the surface of the water. But the Iranian swarm was already changing its tactics. The boats were not staying in a big group anymore. They were splitting up. Some were heading toward the massive oil tankers that were stuck in the middle of the fight. These tankers were carrying millions of gallons of crude oil. They were like giant floating gas cans. If the Iranian boats hit the tankers, the ocean would turn into a sea of fire. The American pilots were looking down at a chaotic mess. From the air, a fishing boat looks exactly like an attack boat. They started to fire their missiles. They hit the fast boats, but they also hit 3 civilian ships by mistake. In the first 60 minutes of this war, the goal was not to win. The goal was just to survive the confusion. Back in Washington, the phone started ringing in the middle of the night. The president was woken up and told that a destroyer had been hit. The advisors were screaming at each other in the Situation Room. Some wanted to drop bombs on every Iranian port immediately. Others warned that if they did that, the price of oil would go to $300 a barrel by noon. The global economy was already starting to feel the shock. The news had not reached the public yet, but the big banks knew. The computer programs that trade oil saw the reports of the attack. They started selling everything. The first hour was ending, and the world was already a different place. The invisible shield was gone, the superpower was bleeding, and the Iranian commander on the shore was looking at his screen with a smile. He had lost 40 boats and 80 men, but he had proven that the giant could be hurt. He picked up his radio and gave one more order. He told the rest of his forces to go after the supply ships. He knew the American ships were powerful, but they needed fuel and food to keep fighting. If he could kill the trucks of the sea, the tanks would eventually stop moving. The first hour was over, but the real nightmare was just beginning. Every army in history has a secret weakness. It is not their armor or their weapons, it is their stomach. A soldier who has not eaten in 3 days cannot fight. A tank that has no fuel is just a very expensive piece of metal sitting in the dirt. The United States Navy is the same way. An aircraft carrier is a city of 5,000 people. It uses millions of gallons of fuel every single day. It needs thousands of pounds of food. It needs fresh water, and in a war, it needs a constant supply of missiles and bullets. The Navy does not keep all of this on the warships. They keep it on supply ships. These are the trucks of the sea. One of these ships is called the United States Naval ship Alan Shepard. It is huge. It is almost 700 feet long. It is filled with everything the fleet needs to keep moving. But there is a problem. The Alan Shepard is not a warship. It does not have thick armor. It does not have the Aegis system. It has a few machine guns and a small crew. It is built to be a helper, not a fighter. In a normal war, these ships stay far away from the front lines. They stay behind the destroyers where it is safe. But in the Strait of Hormuz, there is no backline. The entire waterway is the front line. The Iranian commander knew this. He knew he did not have to sink the aircraft carrier to win. He just had to sink the ships that brought the carrier its lunch. He called this the logistics kill. While the American destroyers were busy fighting the first wave of the swarm, the second wave moved in. They did not go for the ships that could shoot back. They went for the Alan Shepard. They found the supply ship moving slowly through the haze. It was trying to reach the carrier to deliver more missiles. The supply ship was like a giant target painted on the water. 10 fast boats came out from behind a group of rocks. They did not wait. They did not send a warning. They fired their rockets and their heavy machine guns all at once. The crew on the supply ship tried to fight back with their small guns. But it was like trying to stop a flood with a bucket. The fast boats were too many. The first rocket hit the side of the ship where the fuel was kept. The explosion was massive. It was not a small crack like the one on the destroyer. It was a wall of fire that rose hundreds of feet into the air. The Alan Shepard began to die. Within minutes, the ship that was supposed to save the fleet was sinking. This was the moment the American commander realized the true danger. His destroyers had won their battles. They had destroyed dozens of Iranian boats, but they had used up almost half of their missiles to do it. And now, the ship carrying their refills was at the bottom of the ocean. This is the physics of a long war. If you use 10 missiles to kill 10 boats, you are winning the fight but losing the war. Because the other side has 1,000 more boats, and you have 0 more missiles. The American fleet was suddenly in a very bad position. They were low on fuel, they were low on ammo, and they were hundreds of miles away from the next supply base. The ocean around them was becoming a total loss zone. No civilian ship would come near them, no insurance company would cover a ship entering these waters. The global shipping lanes were effectively closed. The giant was not dead, but it was starving. The carrier strike group was now a group of very powerful, very hungry islands. They could still fight for another day or two, but after that, they would just be floating targets. The Iranian commander had proven his point. You do not have to be stronger than your enemy. You just have to be more patient. You just have to wait for them to run out of breath. The world was watching the smoke from the Alan Shepard rise into the sky, and they were realizing that the supply chain of the entire planet was now broken. The price of everything was about to go up, and the most powerful navy in history was about to find out what it feels like to be stranded. The oil did not stop flowing because the wells ran dry. The wells were still full. The pumps were still working. The oil stopped because the water became too expensive to sail on. The moment the supply ship sank, the insurance companies in London made a decision. These are the people who decide if a ship is allowed to work. They look at the risks of the world and they set a price. Usually, that price is small. But that morning, the risk became too high. They told every shipping company that they would no longer protect their ships in the Gulf. They called it a total loss zone. This meant that if your ship was hit, nobody would pay you back. If a ship costs $300 million, you do not take that risk. You do not sail into a war zone without a safety net. So, the giant tankers stopped moving. They dropped their anchors and waited. The ocean that was once the busiest highway in the world became a parking lot. Hundreds of ships sat still in the heat. They were carrying enough oil to power entire countries, but they were not going anywhere. On that first day, the price of oil did not go up slowly. It did not tick up by a few cents. It jumped $50 in a single hour. The computer screens in the big banks started to flash red. People at gas stations in New York and Tokyo watched the signs change while they were standing in line. They saw the numbers climb higher and higher. They did not know about the boats in the strait. They only knew that they could no longer afford to go to work. There is a name for the extra price people pay when they are afraid. It is the cost of fear. It is the money you pay because you think the oil will never arrive. But this was more than just a higher price. It was a collapse. The entire world is built on the idea that things move across the planet without stopping. Your phone, your food, and your car all depend on that movement. The swarm of tiny boats had broken that idea. The factory in Germany could not get the fuel it needed to run the machines. The lights in the big cities began to flicker. The farmer in Brazil could not afford the diesel for his tractor. If the tractor does not move, the food does not grow. Everything in the world is connected by a thin line of water 21 miles wide. It is the throat of the global economy, and Iran had their hands around it. When that line is cut, the world starts to go hungry. Inside the American fleet, the situation was even worse. The destroyers had won their small battles, but they were running on their last reserves of fuel. They were like a sports car with an empty tank. They were still beautiful and powerful. They still had the best weapons ever made. But they were not going anywhere. Without a supply ship, they were just very expensive islands. The Iranian commander watched the news from around the world. He saw the stock markets crashing in London and New York. He saw the leaders of great nations begging for a ceasefire. He realized he had changed the rules of power. He had not used a nuclear bomb. He had not invaded a neighbor. He had just made it too expensive for the world to continue as it was. He had proven that you do not need a bigger navy to win. You just need to be the one who controls the price of living. The war was moving from the water to the streets of every city on Earth. People who had never heard of the Strait of Hormuz were now feeling its power in their pockets. The fight was no longer about missiles and radars. The question was no longer who had the bigger gun. The question was who could afford to keep the lights on for one more day. The superpower had the most tools, but the other side had the keys to the gas station. The silence on the water was the loudest sound in the world. Every hour that passed was another $1 billion gone. Every hour was another step toward a global dark age. The world was waiting for someone to do something, but the American fleet was stuck. They were low on fuel and low on bullets. They were surrounded by a swarm that would not stop coming. And for the first time in 100 years, the giant did not have an answer. The world woke up on Wednesday morning to a reality it did not recognize. For 100 years, the power of the United States was like the air we breathe. It was just there. You did not have to think about it because you knew it could not be moved. If there was a problem anywhere on the planet, the Americans would send a carrier. The carrier would arrive, and the problem would stop. That was the rule. But as the sun rose over the burning wrecks in the Strait of Hormuz, that rule was dead. The image of a tilted destroyer and a sinking supply ship was everywhere. Every leader of every country was staring at their screens. They were seeing something that was supposed to be impossible. The giant had been hit, and the giant was not hitting back yet. This is the moment when the world changes. Power is not just about how many guns you have. Power is about what people believe you can do with them. It is called deterrence. It is the reason people do not attack you in the first place. Deterrence is a shield made of reputation. And that shield had just shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. In the capital cities of America's enemies, the mood was electric. They were not just happy because the Navy was hurt. They were happy because the math of the world had changed. If a few fiberglass boats could stop a billion-dollar ship, then every small country suddenly felt 10 feet tall. They realized they did not need to build a massive navy to challenge the West. They just needed to be brave enough to use cheap tools in clever ways. The Iranian commander became the most famous man on Earth overnight. He had proven that the Aegis system was not magic. He had proven that the giant could bleed. Meanwhile, America's friends were terrified. Countries in Europe and Asia that rely on the United States for protection were suddenly asking a dark question. If the Americans cannot protect a single channel of water, how can they protect us? The phone lines to Washington were jammed with worried presidents and prime ministers. They wanted to know why the most powerful force in history was sitting still. Inside the United States, the reaction was a mix of shock and fury. People were angry that their ships had been touched. They wanted revenge. They wanted the military to use everything it had to flatten the enemy. But the generals and the admirals were being very quiet. They knew something the public did not. They knew that they could not just win this with a single blow. If they launched a massive airstrike, they would use up more of their precious missiles. If they sent more ships, those ships would just face the same swarm. They were staring at a problem that technology could not solve. The Aegis system was still the best in the world. The pilots were still the best in the world. But they were fighting a war of cost. It costs $10 to make a paper cut. It costs $1 million to perform the surgery to fix it. The United States was performing $1 million surgery every 5 minutes. The economy of war was working against them. The world was watching a superpower try to figure out how to fight a ghost. The Iranian boats were not standing still. They were moving back into the coves. They were hiding in the shadows of the cliffs. They were waiting for the next move. The wounded superpower had a choice. It could escalate the war and risk a global collapse. Or it could admit that the age of the supership was over. By the end of that day, the global map looked different. The lines of power had shifted. The small players knew they had a chance. The big players knew they were vulnerable. The era of the Aegis Peace was finished. The world was entering a new age of the small, the cheap, and the many. And the giant was still trying to find its balance. The world's navies did not wait for the smoke to clear before they began to change. The lesson from the Strait of Hormuz was simple. If you put all your power into one ship, you have created a single point of failure. The era of the supership was over. The era of the swarm had begun. For 70 years, the aircraft carrier was the king of the ocean. It was a symbol of total power. If you had a carrier, you controlled the sea. But after the Iranian boats proved they could crack the Aegis shield, the carrier became a liability. It was too big to hide and too expensive to lose. So, the great powers began to build something new. They called it the Cloud Fleet. Instead of one ship that cost $13 billion, they built 1,000 ships that cost $10 million each. Most of these new ships were small. Most of them did not have a single human on board. They were drones. Some were designed to float just under the surface of the water. Others were fast boats made of carbon fiber that were almost invisible to radar. These ships did not have heavy armor. They did not need it. The goal was not to survive a hit. The goal was to be so cheap that the enemy would go broke trying to kill you. This changed the balance of power across the entire planet. Before the swarm, only a few wealthy countries could afford a real navy. You needed billions of dollars and decades of training to build a fleet. But the Cloud Fleet changed the entry price for war. Suddenly, a small nation with a decent tech industry could build a swarm of its own. They did not need a shipyard. They just needed a factory that could make simple engines and computer chips. In the South China Sea and the Mediterranean, the water began to fill with these silent, empty boats. They would sit for weeks, powered by the sun, just waiting for a signal. They were like minds that could think. The United States Navy began to retire its big cruisers and destroyers. They realized that in a world of 1,000 paper cuts, a heavy shield is just a weight that pulls you down. They started building their own swarms. They developed ships that could launch hundreds of drones at once. The ocean became a much quieter place, but it was much more dangerous. You could look at the water and see nothing. But beneath the waves, 10,000 eyes were watching. The naval officers of the old world did not like this new reality. They missed the big ships. They missed the feeling of standing on a bridge and looking out over a massive deck. But the math did not care about their feelings. The math said that 100 small things will always beat one big thing if they all strike at once. This is the rise of the distributed fleet. Power was no longer concentrated in one place. It was spread out like a mist over the water. The giant had not died. It had just broken itself into 1,000 pieces so that it could never be hit in the heart again. 50 years have passed since the day the first swarm broke the shield. The year is 2076. If you stood on the cliffs overlooking the Strait of Hormuz today, the water would look peaceful. The blue waves still hit the rocks. The sun still beats down on the sand, but the world that uses this water is unrecognizable. For most of the 20th century, this place was defined by people who lived thousands of miles away. It was defined by the needs of factories in the West and the power of a navy from across the ocean. That is over now. The Middle East of 50 years later is no longer a gas station for the rest of the planet. It is the center of its own world. The countries around the Gulf stopped looking for a superpower to protect them. They realized that the superpower could be bled by a few fiberglass boats. This realization changed the way these nations talk to each other. They stopped buying $2 billion jets from other countries. Instead, they built their own drone factories in the desert. They realized that security was not something you bought from a salesman in Washington or London. Security was something you built with 1,000 small sensors and a swarm of your own. The cities along the coast have grown into massive hubs of technology. They do not just export oil anymore. They export the very things that once defeated the giant. They sell the software that runs the cloud fleets. They sell the batteries that power the silent drones. The relationship between Iran and its neighbors has shifted. The old rivalries are still there, but the rules are different. When everyone has a swarm, nobody can afford to start a big war. It is like everyone is standing in a room, filled with gasoline, holding a match. It is a tense peace, but it is a local peace. The United States Navy still exists, but it stays far away from these waters. They learned that their massive ships were targets, not tools. They moved their focus to the deep oceans, away from the narrow gaps where the swarm lives. The world has decoupled. The global economy does not rely on a single throat of water anymore. After the collapse of 2026, countries realized they could not put all their eggs in one basket. Europe found new ways to power its homes. Asia built new routes that did not involve the strait. The Middle East became a regional power rather than a global prize. The people living here today do not remember the time of the Aegis Peace. To them, the idea of a giant ship from a different continent telling them what to do sounds like a fairy tale. They live in the age of the many. They live in a world where power is distributed, not concentrated. The landscape is dotted with small, hidden bases. Every island has a cluster of solar panels and a launch rail for a drone. The ocean is a network, not a battlefield. But this new world has its own costs. There is no longer one big policeman to keep the order. If a small conflict breaks out, there is no one to stop it. The world is more local, but it is also more fractured. The lessons of the swarm were learned well. They were learned so well that they changed the map of human power forever. The giant did not just lose a battle that day 50 years ago. The giant lost the right to be the only one who matters. The sun sets over the strait, and the silent drones keep their watch. They are the children of the swarm, and they have made sure that the age of giants will never return. The legacy of the swarm is not just about boats. It is about how we think. For thousands of years, humans thought in pyramids. The king was at the top, the generals were under him, the people were at the bottom. If you killed the king, the pyramid fell over. This was the logic of every empire. This was the logic of the Aegis system. One brain to control everything. One ship to rule the water. One network to run the world. The swarm showed us that the pyramid is a trap. It showed us that the pyramid is brittle. One crack at the bottom can bring the whole thing down. The next 1,000 years of history were the history of the circle. In a circle, there is no top. There is no single point of failure. If you break one part, the rest of the circle just keeps moving. This is why the world changed so deeply. We stopped building things that were the best. A giant dam is the best way to make power, but it is easy to destroy. 1 million solar panels is a messy way to make power, but you can never destroy enough of them to stop the lights. We chose the messy way. We chose the way that was hard to kill. Historians call this the Great Decentralization. It is the long shadow of those fast boats. They did not just sink a ship, they sank an idea. The idea that bigger is better. The idea that the powerful are safe. The idea that technology can solve the problem of numbers. 1,000 years later, the lesson is still the same. Do not be a giant. Be a swarm. Giants are easy to find. Swarms are everywhere. Giants can be tired. Swarms never sleep. Giants eventually run out of energy. Swarms just keep growing. The world today is a swarm of cities. It is a swarm of ideas. It is a swarm of people. And it all started with a fiberglass boat and a lawnmower engine. If you look back at the history books from the year 3000, you will see a strange thing. The 20th century is full of names of famous leaders and massive ships, but the 21st century is full of names of networks. It is full of names of movements. The individual stopped being the focus of history. The group became everything. The swarm was the first time we saw this power in action. It was the first time we realized that 100 small things can beat one big thing. This realization traveled from the water to the land. It traveled from the military to the bank. It traveled from the bank to the school. We stopped looking for heroes to save us. We started looking for ways to connect with each other. The long shadow of the swarm is a world that is impossible to crush. It is a world where there is no one person to surrender. There is no one city to capture. There is no one ship to sink. The giant did not just lose a battle. The giant became obsolete. The world outgrew the need for a heavyweight boxer. It became a world of 1 billion bees. And in that world, the bees are the ones who decide what happens next. The story of the fast boats is the story of how humanity learned to be small again. It is how we learned that resilience is more important than strength. It is how we learned that 1,000 paper cuts will always win. The era of the giant is a ghost. The era of the swarm is our reality. So, what did we learn from the day the swarm broke the shield? The first lesson is that every weapon has a limit. It does not matter how much a ship costs. It does not matter how smart the computer is. If you send enough targets at it, the computer will eventually run out of answers. The math of war is cruel. If it costs you $1 million to stop a $10,000 boat, you are losing. Even if you win the battle, you are losing the war of money. In a long fight, the cheaper side usually wins because they can afford to fail more often. The second lesson is that the supply line is the real target. An army is like a person. It needs to eat and it needs to breathe. The biggest ships in the world are useless if they do not have fuel. They are useless if they do not have more missiles to reload their launchers. We learned that you do not have to sink the aircraft carrier to win. You just have to sink the ships that bring the carrier its lunch. When the supply ships go down, the clock starts ticking for the rest of the fleet. A hungry giant is just a slow target. The third lesson is that the world is far too connected. We built a global economy that depends on a few narrow hallways of water. We thought we were safe because we had a big policeman guarding those hallways. But we learned that one small group of people can turn off the lights in a city on the other side of the planet. They do not need a nuclear bomb. They just need to make it too expensive for ships to move. When the insurance companies stop covering the ships, the world stops moving. We cannot rely on one single path for our survival anymore. The final lesson is that the age of the giant is over. Power used to be something you could see. It was a big castle, it was a big tank, it was a big ship, but today, power is invisible. It is a network of small things working together. It is 1,000 drones. It is 10,000 sensors. It is a swarm that has no heart to hit and no head to cut off. The world has changed from a pyramid to a circle, and in a circle, everyone has a chance to strike. This is a hypothetical scenario based on the military record. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict.